Our guests today are Jennifer Bender, a Boston-based environmental scientist active in bridging gaps between scientists, policymakers, and the public concerning marine and coastal environments. She serves as the executive director of the Marine Studies Consortium, coordinates the UMass School for the Environment, writes for publications, and consults for a range of environmental organizations. She sits on the boards of Sea Ahead, Pleiades, and is a scientific advisor to E25 Bio. Scott J. Soares is the owner of Boston Bay Consulting. Drawing on over 25 years of experience, he offers government relations, business, and organizational management support to those working in aquaculture, agriculture, fisheries, and food systems. He served as the USDA Rural Development State Director for Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. He's the executive director of the U.S. Cranberry Marketing Committee and in a variety of leadership positions with the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources. Bree Warner is CEO and president of Atlantic Sea Farms, the leading line-grown seaweed aquaculture business in the U.S. She's passionate about working with kelp farmers in Maine to create more resilient and thriving coast. Bree has served several tours as diplomat to the U.S. Foreign Service, started and sold a wholesale bakery, and created the first economic development programming suite at the Maine-based Island Institute. And Aaron is here as founder of media company All Consuming Behavior. He hosts the popular show Sourcing Matters and the UN talk show series 90 Tracks. He's also a fishmonger focused on preserving the unique values of the region. He's from a sourcing agency, fishmonger, and co-founder of One Health Ag. He was selected as 2015 Eisenhower Fellow to explore the impact of good and bad resource management. And before we jump in, I just want to mention that we are here with us. We have a sponsor. It's the New England Biolabs. We have a little bit of a history where we are developing this series of events focusing on regenerative agriculture and aquaculture and ways that we can combine the two. So this particular series is focused a lot on the North Shore, and we are the North Shore of Massachusetts. And so we're working in local connections. And obviously, one of the reasons we're bringing in all of these folks from Massachusetts and Maine is because there's a new and sort of developing series of practices. And we're here in Massachusetts, we're sort of catching on in different places. And so over the course of this year, you'll hear from folks like Jennifer Bender and all of our guests here about this, the development in this regenerative aquaculture and ways that we all as consumers and farmers are benefiting from these sorts of relationships. So with that, it would be my pleasure to turn it over to Jennifer Bender.
Thank you, Doug. So I just wanted to say good morning to everyone and thank everyone for coming. Luckily, it's not a bad morning to stay inside. I think where most of these people are calling in from. I'd like to thank my panelists for participating in this conversation on updates, opportunities, and challenges in and of seaweed. I'm going to ask each panelist to give you a little history about their background and how they got to this point in their careers. And we're going to actually have the panelists go through different areas of subject matter. And then at the end of everyone's talk, then we're going to be open for questions. So I'm going to start with Aaron Needle-Hellman. He'll give you some information about his path and then begin our discussion on regenerative ag and aquaculture and maybe a tad on social license. Thank you, Aaron.
Thanks, Jennifer. And hello, everybody. Good morning. I was excited to hear that this was spawned out of the North Shore of Massachusetts. I live in Ipswich, so that was kind of a secondary element I just learned about, and I'm pretty enthusiastic about the correlation and the crossover between what's happening in the terrestrial world and now what's happening in the aquatic food product side of things. So a bit about my background. Doug, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, I cut my teeth mostly in terrestrial production models focused on trying to introduce and engage regionalized food production with large-scale or mid-scale agricultural farms converting to regenerative best practice on food animal production. But through that, living in New England for years, I saw that correlation, the crossover between what's happening in the terrestrial world and then what happened in the aquatic and marine environment in our wonderful estuaries. And I have done numerous different projects and work with Bree and Scott in the past, met Jennifer in the past, became a pretty small community of things that have been working on. And it's exciting to see this now coming full circle where regenerative is becoming a discussion. Doesn't matter what the substrate or what the environment is, that we're talking about the same basic notion that I think Rodell said it best, that regenerative, effectively the most concise and clean line for it is that everything is renewed in the process of using it. And that effectively means that we are engaging with natural order. We are reconnecting with natural systems and shepherding our involvement with those natural systems, whether it's soil health or estuaries or marine environments, puts a responsibility for us not to be custodians, but to basically reconnect ourselves into those ecological systems and those best practices. On the terrestrial side, I'll start there. I think that was my intro to kind of lay some of the ground here to talk about where the enthusiasm, which is definitely from what I've seen, the experience I've been involved, the terrestrial side, the soil health side of things has been the place where most people have been talking about regenerative. It has been something that has somewhat been commandeered into being a bit of a buzzword. It's kind of greenwashing in certain elements, but there are certain thought leaders in the space that have been involved in this from day one that are going back to our early days of looking at why soil health is so important and investing in those frameworks. I usually follow what Gabe Brown has defined as the 5 principles of regenerative, which is, low disturbance, understanding that these natural ecological systems like soil have natural guards. This is a living community, a natural ecosystem. The value that are based in there, we just have to work on protecting those things. To look at investing in biodiversity, the health of the soils is investing in those living communities, those ecological systems. Keeping a living root, our involvement of actually keeping things involved in growing as long as possible. And then introducing other trophic levels of living creatures, other living beings, being the 5th element. So animals, insects, encouraging us, we're not creating monocultures, but you're actually, again, a good grass farmer is really a good soil farmer, and kind of work up that best practice approach. In dealing with folks on the terrestrial side, obviously on the marine side, you realize that it's the same idea from shellfish producers, or what Bree's doing up with kelp in Maine, what Brent Smith's done down in Long Island Sound. The enthusiasm is to invest in these ecological systems to protect our marine environments. Jennifer's done a lot of work at UMass and working on numerous different initiatives to educate this next generation of folks of how that is so important. What's really interesting on the kelp production side and shellfish production is we're moving from really this extractive model of having to, on the terrestrial side, of having to infuse and put the chemicals needed to grow things in a conventional model, trying to re-engage things into this idea of returning to natural order, natural systems, really trying to look at where nature-based capital can grow our future crops. On the aquatic side, I get enthused because the whole model is even the next iteration past that. It's really this idea that, planting kelp or putting shellfish into these controlled environments actually is a net positive. You're investing back into those marine environments, and your crop comes out from not having to put in any kind of energy influx or any kind of required NPK or fertilizers or persistent pesticides or herbicides. It really is a opportunity to kind of look at where this next protection or next opportunity of food production happens. I know Bree will go into more detail on that, and Scott, obviously with his background in aquaculture and shellfish production, can give you a little more lay of the land. I think where I see it, where I get excited by this, is just this connection, again, coming from the North Shore, this connection that we have once isolated the terrestrial production models and raising animals and raising crops are always isolated and siloed, and definitely something very different than what you see in a marine and aquatic environment. But as we've kind of learned with supply chains, they often have the same buyers at some of these larger purchasers and production facilities. So the potential to then connect and use the consumer, empower consumers to understand what regenerative can really represent, creates a very positive impact to all of these production models. And I think as people awaken to the idea that regenerative is an empowerment message, that 3 times daily we can vote for the planet, we can vote for each other on the social impact side of things, that these types of roles, these types of production models create good jobs. They invest in our systems, our local communities. They have local dollars spent. They have a net positive job creation for doing local food production. And that is married both in the terrestrial and in the marine environment. So, I think it's early days, and I think we are still learning as we go here, especially in regenerative models of in an aquatic environment. But as a entrepreneur myself, I always have a glass half full perspective on things, and I'm enthused by the talented people that are getting into this space, the volumes of consumers that are looking for regenerative food production, and the interest in just the overall concept that food is this empowerment for a better planet and for better social issues. So I'm happy to answer your questions at the end, but at least an introduction to the NOFA conference of what can happen for regenerative ocean farming. So
thank you, Aaron. Thanks. Scott Soares is going to update us on the MSI, or the Mass Shellfish Initiative, and continue the conversation, or maybe dabble a little bit in the conversation around social license. And Scott, your path to this point is pretty interesting. So maybe just a blurb about kind of the path that you took.
Sure. Thanks, Jen, and thank you all for joining our session today. I'll start the story back in the early 90s, where I was a state's in Massachusetts first aquaculture program coordinator. Up until that point, there really wasn't any concerted effort in Massachusetts to really look at the development of aquaculture in its broadest sense. And at that time, there was some shellfish aquaculture production underway to the tune of about $4 million farm gate value. So that's the actual dollars that were received by the growers at that time. And there was some inland, and still is some inland freshwater aquaculture in Massachusetts, primarily trout, but also one very unique facility in Western Massachusetts that's a totally enclosed recirculating aquaculture system that's grown a variety of finfish species, everything from some marine or euryhaline or brackish water species, all the way up to today, where they're growing a fish called barramundi that's actually out of Australia. So in the early 1990s, as I mentioned, there was really no program underway. So the effort was really to try to integrate and look at the programs that got aquaculture up and running more in Massachusetts. And the challenges for shellfish are very true for the challenges that are facing marine sea greens, kelp, or seaweeds in the open environment that we see today. And principally, they start with my pet peeve that lasts to this day here in Massachusetts, that aquaculture doesn't happen, marine aquaculture doesn't happen where it's best for marine aquaculture to happen. It happens where nothing else wants to happen. And that is still the case, that ultimately to get up and growing shellfish, or kelp for that matter, in Massachusetts, you really need to make sure that you're not impacting any of the recreational current commercial activities that are out there now. So it's very difficult to get up and started. And just to put a fine point on that, in terms of shellfish aquaculture, there are right now about 1,300 acres that are under cultivation for shellfish aquaculture. That number is about 300 acres more than it was 30 years ago. So it hasn't grown a lot, but despite that growth in area being cultivated, the growth in the industry is such, for the shellfish in particular, that the industry grew from that 4 million farm gate value that I mentioned back about 30 years ago to 2019 numbers, where it was upwards of $30 million farm gate value just in oysters, farm raised oysters. So the industry has done well to grow despite the limitations on access to areas, and there's some effort underway now to see how those areas can expand, and that brings us into the work with sea greens and sea kelp in particular. For Massachusetts, we're at really 4 farms altogether. One of those farms is a project that's not only growing shellfish, so they're multi-cropping. They're doing shellfish, but they also have lines that they put out for sea green, sea kelp, sugar kelp in the wintertime. The nice part is they're often referred to as counter-cyclic crops. So you can grow your shellfish during the summertime and then grow your sea kelp during the winter months. Although I know from talking to the growers, it's not very fun to be out there, especially on days like today, to see how that crop is doing. But nonetheless, they grow great despite the tough weather that's out there. So right now, between those 4 operations, we have a total of about 62 acres that's being cultivated in Massachusetts, and very little of that 62 acres actually has the horizontal lines that are used for the cultivation of kelp in those waters. And again, in large part because of the concerns that are out there around the gear and how do you secure a site so that you don't get into a boat, or more recently, things like whale entanglement, right? Whale habitat, especially in Cape Cod Bay, is a very protected resource that even for the lobstermen that I know when Bree mentions that they've converted to look at integrating kelp into their own operations, it's become a real challenge to fish or farm those areas because of potential endangered species interaction. But back to my story. So I started as the aquaculture coordinator back in the early 90s and went all the way through my career of about 20 years, just a little north of 20 years with the state of Massachusetts, leaving as commissioner in 2015. And all through that time, one of the things we tried to do, looking at food systems specifically, was how do we better integrate marine-based or aquatic-based food products with terrestrial food products? Because especially for us New Englanders, it's hard to imagine when you're eating a great piece of fish or eating a plate of shellfish that you're not also going to have some potatoes, or you're going to have some onions or some other crops alongside it. So likewise, when you look at that plate, that's all the bounty of what we harvest as part of the food system here in New England. So really trying to integrate those systems, it should be a no-brainer, but the reality is it's become really challenging in large part because marine cultivation, marine activities are regulated all the way up through one line of agencies, one up to the federal agencies, it's to the Department of Commerce. And on the terrestrial side, it's the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, that governs all of the activities, promotion, grants, and regulation around the terrestrial side. So trying to bring those together, you would think would be an easy feat, but it has not been. And still to this day, it's a challenge to launch this new form of agricultural production, because aquaculture is a form of agriculture. In fact, the fastest growing form of agriculture, that it's not an easy feat to accomplish. But all that said, there are opportunities for sure. And as demonstrated by what's happened with the shellfish industry, increasingly consumers are looking at farm-raised product and recognizing that farm-raised product, and as Aaron described, as an extractive form of agriculture that not only is generating great high-quality protein products in the form of, in our case, farm-raised oysters, but also has really distinct and measured environmental benefits, not only from that extractive nature where they're sequestering carbon and nitrogen that's in the water by just their own grazing on phytoplankton, but the habitat and ecosystem services that they provide by essentially providing a reef structure that once you have the shellfish there, it also provides habitat for other fish, smaller fish that are eaten by bigger fish, and you can follow the chain all the way along. So there's real benefit on the environmental and the economic side. So we're hoping that that continues to grow. And we do see in Massachusetts, kelp and sea greens cultivation as a real opportunity, but it's slow, as I mentioned, slow going to try to get the correct regulatory structure, the correct permits in place, the correct approvals, especially in a place like Massachusetts, where we are really what's referred to as a home rule state, where the towns themselves can craft their own regulations, their own permissions or prohibitions to any type of marine activity out to 3 miles. So it's a challenge to get the growing component up. But beyond that, there are opportunities on the processing side that there still needs to be fleshed out, that there are limited processing facilities, in fact, none in Massachusetts right now. That really is the bottleneck. It's not as difficult to grow the product, and you'll likely hear this from Bree, as it is to really get to the processing and value adding and creating ultimately ingredients or CPG products that can be sold directly to the consumers. And right now, it looks like most of that product actually comes when people are consuming sea greens kelp. 99% of that at this point, and Bree will probably correct me on this, is actually of foreign origin. So really trying to get at, the plus minus of having good regulations that, protect our marine coastal resources, but at the same time aren't so protective that they ultimately stymie the development of these new and growing industries. So I'm hoping that covers enough of it, and we can move on. Jen, you're muted.
Yeah. Next, I'm going to ask Brianna Warner to speak. Brianna really took an interesting path to seaweed. So hopefully she'll tell you a little bit about that, discuss markets and a little bit more. And then hopefully we'll circle back to social license a bit, because it is a bit of an elephant in the room in all of our states that I suspect we're calling in from, and then go on to kind of the next topic that I wanted to talk to. Thanks, Bree.
Yeah, I may actually move right after I talk, because I'm under a skylight and it's -10 today, and the chill that I'm getting through my body right now is like unbelievable. So I might move halfway after this. So if I go off camera for a second, that's why, to try to get near the fireplace. But I'm up here in Maine. We really did take a different tact. I think prior to about 4 years ago, the entire seaweed sector in the United States was really like a nonprofit sector. And it was a lot of scientists doing really good work, a lot of nonprofits really kind of focused on trying to figure out, like, how do people eat seaweed? And in a lot of ways, people were just kind of overcomplicating the question. How do we eat seaweed is you make seaweed taste good. And that's sort of it. And that's really what we've kind of focused on up here. We are in the Gulf of Maine, which is warming faster than 99% of oceans in the world. So most of the people here obviously live in that area and may or may not know that. And so the importance of diversification is not only urgent, but it's imperative if we're going to continue to look out onto the water and think of it as anything other than an area completely covered by condos and high-end hotels. We know that's happened on the West Coast. We know that's happened on many parts of the East Coast. We have very few working waterfront communities left in the United States that are affordable for the people who work them and who provide essential services and foods for the rest of the country. We import the vast majority of our seaweed and seafood into the United States, the overwhelming majority. And seaweed is not an exclusion to that. And so while at the same time that we are losing these working waterfronts, demand for seafood is going up and up and up. Just as we're talking about traceability and stewardship and good conservation. And just at that time, we're saying, like, okay, but we're not going to help actually try to preserve the working waterfront communities that we have to ensure that we can have sustainable seaweed for the future. And I think what Scott and Aaron said is really important context for sort of what the opportunity we may even be missing is, because people kind of talk about how they want more sustainable foods, how they want more sustainable seafood. And the opportunity is here right now in New England, more than anywhere else in a lot of ways. Alaska maybe is the other place, but we can grow really sustainable food really, really well. That's very traceable, great for the environment. And we have a lot of ocean and really protected waters that make it very to grow aquacultured seafood in the country and the world. And so for me, here in Maine, we have these 4,000 plus lobster license holders. Unlike in Massachusetts or elsewhere, our lobster industry is an owner-operator industry. If you have a license, you must be on your boat when you fish it. I like to kind of like stick my nose up at you Massachusetts people, Scott and Aaron, with our owner-operator model. We don't have fleets of boats. There's not a bunch of one person with all of the money and people working those boats that may not. These are people, if they are on their boats, it is their livelihood, it is their community's livelihood, and it is their family's livelihood, because quite frankly, there's not anything else, any other economic opportunities in these areas. And the lobster industry right now is thriving. It's not like there's no subsidies on the industry, which is very unique for fishing in the United States. There's no quotas because there doesn't have to be, because there's been so much conservation put in place, including preserving egg-bearing females into the brooding stock, an upper and lower size limit, which is vastly different than Massachusetts and Canada. And so we've basically preserved, I'm sitting here like Maine, but I mean, it's true. We've kind of preserved the industry. So there's no need for these sort of strict, conservation measures as put on the industry, because they're putting it on themselves. Having said that, no matter what they have done to that industry, there's going to be a point where the water is so warm that the lobster larvae are no longer going to survive at the rate that they are today. And those working waterfronts that we value so much in this state, in one of our top industries, and what makes us Maine, people, when they think of Maine, they don't think of like condos, and they think of a rocky coast and a lobsterman. And that is true. That is actually who we are. It is what we live on our coast. And that is extremely threatened by this global change in temperature, not by a local change in how we take care of our industry. So what we need to do is think about ways to diversify. And I think in economic development in general, we often talk about people, let's say in coal country, where I'm from, in Pennsylvania, like, okay, well, then we'll just turn people into making solar we'll put them in the solar industry. Like, oh, wait, but there is no correlation between the skills in the coal sector to the solar sector. Like, let's take this person and call it a widget and put that widget into another category. Like, people aren't widgets. They are people, and there are skill sets, and there are passions, and people are passionate about the things that they do. And up here in Maine, people are passionate about being on the water, and their grandfathers have done it, and their grandfathers' grandfathers have done it, and their kids want to do it. So how do we mobilize the strength that they have and the conservation ethics that they have, as well as the physical assets that they have, like a 35-foot boat and a hauler, and figure out ways that they can diversify their income so all their eggs aren't in one basket? And we are not talking about saying to people like, give up lobster, go into seaweed. Like, I will never say that. But what I will say is, hey, you're not fishing 4 months a year. Let's figure out how to use your equipment to make some extra money in your off season to help absorb some of that shock of the volatility in the industry. So we started on this crusade of sorts in the end of 2018 to start bringing fishermen on to grow kelp. And in the United States in 2018, the entire harvest was around 45,000 pounds. After 3 years of working with fishermen who are better farmers than anyone out there, it's pretty easy to learn for them. It takes about 3 hours on the water, and they've got it. Doesn't take much. We now are growing 1.3 million pounds this year with 27 partner farmers up and down the coast of Maine, from Portland to Eastport. And so for us, the growing the kelp is the easy part. I mean, it's hard work. Like Scott said, it's miserable out there in February on a day like this. Luckily, it doesn't take much maintenance. They spend about 2 weeks on the water total over a 4-month period to grow that kelp. But what our role is to find uses for the kelp and to build demand. And so far, we've done that mostly in food. We have retail products like fermented seaweed salads and smoothie cubes and all of the stuff that we have selling across the country in Whole Foods and Sprouts and fast casual chains like Sweetgreen or Chopped or those kind of places. But we now have the volume that we can start thinking about working with animal feed and fertilizers. And Sean Barrett from Montauk Seaweed Company, who we work with very closely, will be talking at the NOFA conference, I believe, later this afternoon, talking more about kind of the fertilizer. So I'll leave that to him because he's really the expert on it, and we're working with him to figure out that channel. But the feed part is something we're working with several scientific organizations, including Bigelow Labs, where we're looking at stronger outcomes for pigs, like reduced mortality in piglets by eating fermented kelp. or reduce methane emissions for cows, which is very exciting and a noble cause, but we need to prove out that there is actually commercial value to that for fishermen, for farmers as well. But, you know, that guys, those are the animal feeds, but there's also things like people are using seaweeds in plastics, people are using seaweeds in cardboards, people are using seaweeds in textiles. And we are working with all these organizations to figure out the ways that we can incorporate our seaweed into those multiple uses, because for us, you know, food is one thing and we're using our highest value stuff to do that. But if we can create a market that kind of accepts A, B, and C kelp, and we can get 200 fishermen in the water, then we're making a real impact that can actually help absorb the shock of the industry for climate change. And I mean, as an extra piece, seaweed is grown with no water, no air, no fresh water, no arable land, no pesticides, all of that. Like, the environmental impact, it's the best possible thing you can eat. Oysters, mussels, and seaweed are the three best foods, three best products you can grow and eat in the world, known to man. And because they're better for the environment, they take no input, and they can mitigate some of the effects of climate change. And so if we're growing one of those three, and maybe substituting something that's not on your plate because you're eating seaweed that's doing better for the environment, and helping people adapt to climate change, then we have done it right. So that's what we're up to. And I'm really excited to be on this panel because it's fun when we think about kind of the policy side and the corporate side really need to be focused together. And oftentimes they talk past each other. And it's one of the reasons I love talking to Scott and Aaron, is they have such a foot in both sides of that world. And it's so unique. And it's really exciting for us because we often go on panels where we're like, oh my God, what world are we talking about? Like, people just want to get like 70 seaweed farmers in the water with no market. Like, what? Like, that's not actually how the world works. And so it's really great to be on a panel where people are thinking about these things, thinking about what that means, and making sure policy just clears the way for companies like ours to really innovate and grow that supply chain.
Thank you, Bree. So I do want to circle back to one thing that we kind of touched on, which is social license, right? I think that there's this kind of social perception of seaweed farming that we didn't totally address. And then also the acceptability or perceived legitimacy of a seaweed project in a community, by the community and by stakeholders, because these are a lot of bumps, not just clearly in seaweed, but in a lot of kind of new aquaculture growth and licensing. So I wanted to talk about that right now. And then after that, there's this elephant in the room called carbon sequestration. And we didn't really talk about that. And there's tremendous interest around that topic. And I have a lot of opinion there as well. But so let's start maybe, Scott, with the social license in Massachusetts and kind of what that looks like right now, and ways to approach it. And then the three of you can kind of bounce that around a bit.
Sure. Thanks, Jen. Yeah, and I think I touched on it from the perspective of the way licensing and access to the growing areas happens in places like Massachusetts. And I'll describe it from the Massachusetts perspective, which is, as you heard from Bree, is very different, not only from Maine, but from many other states. Because Massachusetts is a commonwealth, that ultimately in this state, the 34 coastal communities up and down the state that have water that is farmable, quote unquote. So it's good water quality that can be used for shellfish or sea green production. And because of the Magnuson Fisheries Act that gives us authority to farm out to or access waters out to 3 miles, you have quite an amount of acreage, and on the order of millions of acres that are available for farming. And I think part of what we're seeing now is that some think, unfortunately, the access that's being allowed for larger wind farm installations, et cetera, what they have to go through to ultimately get those in place, it's really, if they can afford to pay for the attorneys to ultimately go through a very rigorous permitting process that ultimately isolates those areas from any other types of uses. So the same is thought, even though at a much smaller scale, for shellfish aquaculture or for sea greens, sea kelp aquaculture in Massachusetts. Although the local communities don't have the same say in Massachusetts as they do for shellfish aquaculture. The permitting process still is not well defined in Massachusetts. How do you even start? How do you even get out to get a farm in the water, to get your first lines out to start to grow kelp? Where do you source it from? What's a certified source? There are more questions than there are answers at this point for the cultivation of sea kelp. But again, on the shellfish side, many of those questions have been answered, but it's still the access is very limited. And I see that in some ways touching on, social inequities when you come down to who is actually able to access those areas. For many towns, because again of that Commonwealth situation, characteristic, the home rule authority in Massachusetts, for many of those towns, they have for shellfish aquaculture what they call residency requirements. Those residency requirements, as the word implies, means you have to be a resident of that community to ultimately access, that water area, whether it's a half acre or up to the largest farm we have in the state is about 50 acres at this point. But to access that water, that's one of the threshold requirements. That threshold requirement immediately eliminates anybody, not only outside of those communities, but people even within those communities that don't have the knowledge or wherewithal, economic or otherwise, to ultimately invest in, what can be a costly operation when you start to look at not necessarily just the shellfish and the seed that you buy annually to stock your farm. The same is true for sea kelp, but the gear it takes to actually manage and monitor those farms. And this is where you start to look at, Bree mentioned, for a lot of people wanting to go out and start to grow kelp automatically. The same is true on the shellfish side, that if you don't have a place to market that product before you start growing all that product, you're in trouble because the kelp keeps growing, the shellfish keep growing. And the pandemic actually highlighted one of the challenges that faced the industry with, again, that 2019 number of 30 million, that was 50 million oysters that were grown and sold in Massachusetts in 2019. That industry was cut in half the next year. By the end of the year, we lost more than 30 million sales opportunities for those 30 million oyster sales opportunities. So what do you do with all those? So then you just have to start to look at the product development side. That again, the limitations on that are not only the places that will do it, but the capital to make that happen. So how do you access the capital to ultimately process that product and get it to market? So there are some limitations that are almost baked into the process that really run up against the social license, the ability for anybody to get out and to really work the water the way traditionally fishermen were able to go and buy a license and access the commons. One of the challenges we run into when we start looking at the kelp farms or aquaculture shellfish farms is that once you get that piece of bottom or that water column, that three-dimensional piece of farm to farm in the coastal waters, you have to have some limitations on access to that, not only for protection of your farm and protection of the property, but just protection of those who might get tangled up in your lines and anybody who might get injured if they end up wandering into a farm itself. So it's starting to look at how do you lease out components of this common area that everybody would have access to navigate or to swim through or to fish, but at the same time use that for the betterment of the entire community, our food system, by using those areas to maximize food production. One of the important characteristics of that is on the licensing, the only way, and this is again for shellfish in particular in Massachusetts, that you can get a farm established. And I'm not sure, again, because the licensing hasn't been established in Massachusetts for offshore marine kelp, is that, as I mentioned, my pet peeve, nothing else can be growing there. They can't have any other product there. So you're basically looking at barren bottom to begin with that, yeah, it may have been productive at one time, but now overfished or for whatever reason, shellfish aren't growing there anymore. It's a bit of a risk that a grower takes when they go out and license this area to start growing because they don't know for sure if the shellfish will grow there. If they're not growing there because just biologically, physically, they can't grow in those areas, or if there's just because there's no oysters there to spawn. There's no shellfish there to spawn because they've been overfished. So it really starts to blend, I think, what was at one time and still is commercial fishing and access to commercial fisheries resources is still important. It's still a 90 million metric tons of production globally. And I don't expect that's going to go away. I expect there'll be some declines, but they'll still be an important part of accessing food. But integrating the ability to actually utilize these water spaces for cultivation of marine organisms, shellfish or sea kelp, or eventually, even like we do in Maine with the salmon net pens, et cetera, that there needs to be some way to blend those so that they don't appear or be conceived by the local communities as taking away, but rather as additive to their local food system by providing greater access to great high quality protein and vegetable product that otherwise may not be available at all if not imported.
Aaron, you looked like you were, something was clicking, so I thought maybe follow up here.
I always have that kind of inquisitive look on my face, Jen. I have, just no. I always enjoy listening to Scott. He's so knowledgeable about this stuff, and it's true. It's made a few things that, yeah, definitely struck a nerve for me. Yeah, I mean, I think the social inequalities are robust across all agricultural sectors. It's land access is a good example of the most challenging thing for folks to start something new. Sounds like just looking at some of the folks we have on as in the audience, and it's often young farmers that are engaged in this space that are trying to get on to starting something, and land access in the terrestrial world is very challenging to even begin. It's expensive. You have required operational expenses. Then we're going to sell your product. How do you get up to speed? Who's going to finance things? I think there was a bit of an overpromise within this space, within sea green production, within aquaculture early days, that 10, 20,000 bucks, come on in and everybody can get land access, robust opportunity to start moving product. And that is being sussed out as that may not always be the case. There are, intricate and nuanced elements for every state, every community, every region. Some locations have it via state, some locations have it via town to get to access. I mean, even in the North Shore, we'll go back to that conversation. To actually farm shellfish, there's, to do oyster production, there's one guy in Raleigh that's doing it, compared to the South Shore of Massachusetts, that it's a very different approach where you have a very different licensing model. And part of that is within the industry of a bit of a latent approach of, we're clammers up in the North Shore. We don't need to invest in shellfish production or kelp production. So there is this transitional process. And I think what I try to leverage, what I always use, and I'm a sucker for good storytelling, are these good beacons of hope. And to be honest, I mean, one of the best examples is Bree. I use Bree as an example often in these conversations about someone that is successfully kicking these programs off, that has started a business, has created a very creative and sustainable economic model of working with lobstermen in Maine, supplementing their revenue stream, working with the people that own the bottom, finding new mechanisms to make kelp the consumer enthusiastic by working with lifestyle brands like what you see with sweet greens and interesting fermentation to connect with food being a lifestyle choice and performance and other elements. So I think those examples do surely help get people excited that these can happen. There's a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of additional work, and I think there are a lot of resources. Scott's a great person to chat with if you have intrigue in this. And I think, Jennifer, the work that you're doing on the academic side too, which is, in New England, we've got this unique infrastructure where our academic framing can help be a spearhead here. We can really leverage these things. I think you had chatted in early days, and I'd love you to speak to this if you could, about launching a course load around kelp production, if I remember correctly, and what that can then have as representation for producers and buyers and consumers. So it's early days, but those folks that are sitting here listening to this conversation, folks like Bree that are involved in it, folks like Scott that are, helping to pave these paths, those are those beacons of hope. Those help change the model. That's how we're going to reframe this approach. And I too, I mean, I come at it from food is one of our best mechanisms of climate action. It is an empowering message for all of us on the production side, on the consumer side, to actually be engaged. We don't have to wait for a 4-year election cycle to try to put the right person in office to have some impact on the planet. 3 times daily, what you do or what your impact is can truly be tied to how we treat these environmental and ecological systems. And something like seaweed and shellfish production are those pinnacle examples. And then on that social side, Jennifer, just to kind of close this out, when you have folks like Bree like what Skip and Krista with Creek, what the opportunities that are now happening even in the southern part of New England, Rhode Island, where 100 years ago, well, now we have like 150 acres in shellfish production in aquaculture. 150 years ago, there were 20,000 acres in active production. So we have a lineage in this, and there's a lot of opportunity to then connect those dots and bring in this enthusiasm, bring in this social empowerment message from so many people within our communities. That it's, I just look at it as it is not on our shoulders, but it is that empowerment message for all of us to help stake new claims and to create new opportunities for this generation next that are engaged in these conversations.
Thank you, Aaron. I love that quote, food is a beacon for climate action. It's inspiring in many ways. I want to jump right now because we haven't touched on it at all, and I'm very opinionated in this topic, but I'd rather hear everyone else about carbon sequestration and seaweed. There's a lot of talk or buzz, I think it's more buzz, about seaweed can and will kind of save us from global warming or climate change or warming oceans. And I see Bree smiling, so I'm going to jump off with you, starting there.
I want to first just back on the social license piece for 1 second, say that just because there is, we kind of always think, I always think, maybe it's because I'm stupidly optimistic at times, but that once you solve something and you've achieved the good system, it'll stay. And in Maine, we have one of the best aquaculture licensing systems out there. It is fair for the community. It is fair for the license holder or the license applicant. It is done well. And it is absolutely being threatened by people who feel like they should have decision-making over what they see from their $3 million properties. And Massachusetts, Alaska, they've all these states have done, Connecticut have all done reports about what sort of licensing system they would like to see to grow aquaculture in harmony with community opinions, and they all point to Maine. And we are on the verge of that going away in Maine because people don't want to see it. And I think social license is something that we think about uniquely on the water. If there's a farm going by down the street in my hometown in Cumberland, I don't get to say, I just don't like it. I just don't want that farm there. Like, I don't get that opinion. It goes through the planning board, but I don't get to say whether I think it's a good idea if someone grows corn down the street or not. It's none of my business. And that is totally not how we think of working on the water. And I find that to be just a change that we need to be thinking about when we think of social license. Like, why on earth should people, if it's not a navigation hazard, it's not an environmental hazard, and it's not a gear conflict issue of existing uses, why on earth should Fred down the street have an opinion about how I'm growing and what I'm growing? And I think it's really important to kind of think about that mind shift. This is not true for any other industry. In Maine, it's easier for a marijuana grower and a marijuana seller to get the property that they need than it is for someone who wants to grow oysters.
I just want to add, and I don't want to go down this slope because it's slippery, is that, right, the public trust, the global commons, we all come back to this mindset, which come out of the laws of King George, right, hundreds of years ago, that the waters were the global commons. And so I think there's a different mindset in the social license space that has somehow morphed into that NIMBYism or the I don't want to see something from my property, right? I think that it comes out of a different ethic.
I think that's absolutely right. And one of the ways we help with social license here is, on like when Scott was saying, like the price of the seed, we give our farmers free seed and we guarantee purchase of everything that they grow. So they have a built-in market, which sort of gets them down the line of that. But separate from social license, the S word, sequestration, is something that people, I think we see this in oysters a little bit less because it's a little bit more established, in mussels a little bit less, but in seaweed it is the Wild West of snake oil. And it's brand new, so people can say whatever they want to say about it and people will believe it. And there's just no scientific proof that seaweed can sequester carbon when you eat it. And let me kind of talk about the mechanics of that a little bit more. There's incredible amount, like, let's just say what the statement I made earlier, I will hold to till the end of time, which is the 3 best things to grow in the planet are mussels, oysters, and seaweed. And that seems like pretty good. Like, I don't know why we need to reach further than that. Like, that is pretty much like, it is the best food on the planet that you could possibly eat or grow. And one of the reasons for that is, as we know, there's so much carbon in the air, an excess of carbon. And when it hits the ocean, that ocean absorbs that carbon. And what that does is it changes the pH of the ocean and it makes it more acidic. Now, we've all heard about ocean acidification. It is such a new occurrence in the world that we don't fully understand as a scientific community what the effects of ocean acidification is. One thing we do know, though, is that it can have a very negative impact on shell-bearing organisms. So that means oysters, mussels, clams. It appears that lobsters actually don't get affected by ocean acidification in the same way as bivalves, but kind of most importantly, phytoplankton, which is the most important way of producing oxygen we always think of trees. It's phytoplankton that gives us most of our oxygen. But I think what we do know is there is, as that ocean becomes more acidic, just as you pour like Coca-Cola on something, that acidity just like erodes at hard surfaces like shell-bearing organisms. So we've done a lot of studies that have been proven out that underneath the kelp halo of a kelp farm, shell-bearing organisms do better and have better lifetime outcomes, meaning that only in 6 months of growing under our seaweed halo, mussels have double the shell strength in just that time. And even if they're never under seaweed again for the next 3 years, their outcomes are better and their shell strength is stronger over that 3-year period. Their mussel meat is also more, but it's likely because they're feeding from kind of the detritus that's falling down from the kelp and eating up that yummy algae and making it bigger. But that is sort of the carbon and positive impact it can have, is underneath the kelp halo, there is significant effects, local mitigation of climate change. Now, people then take that and reason, oh, well, that means that if I take it out of the water and I eat it, I'm sequestering carbon. But our bodies are not permanent carbon stores. We're not just made of carbon. The more carbon we eat, it doesn't just like stay. It's like when you eat vitamin C, it doesn't just stay in your body forever. So it's, there's no sort of, the temporary effects or the local effects of planting kelp are significant, but it's not over a lifetime, and it's not going to remove carbon from the world permanently. Now, there is some exciting evidence that if it is put into fertilizers and put on the land, there is a much more, a longer temporary effect on sequestering some of that carbon. It's not permanent sequestration, but it does put it into the soil that can help some of that carbon. There's a third argument that you can grow a shit ton of kelp, float it out to the middle of the ocean and sink it. And somehow that's going to sink the carbon forever. There is some scientific analysis that actually says that that is true. If you take a bunch of kelp and you sink it to the bottom of the ocean, it can be thousands of years before it comes up. What is not possible is doing that safely for marine organisms, understanding the effects on the bottom of the ocean, or really anything. Like when you want to grow millions of, miles and miles of kelp and sink it to the bottom of the ocean and have a bunch of rope that's going to somehow biodegrade. Like it's not, it's fiction. But if there was a way to figure out how to grow kelp, put kelp on the bottom of the ocean without any negative effects, which there's not, it could be exciting. But what we can focus on is what can we do in terrestrial agriculture that can be using some of that kelp and actually think about how that can be sequestering some carbon. And that is an exciting area of study. Unfortunately, people are getting distracted by the excitement of something that sounds cool, like we're going to sink so much kelp, but that is really like a different topic. But there is some really exciting work there. I think the last piece I'll say is we are working on a study with Oceans 2050, which should be coming out in the next few months, that there is some evidence that the detritus that falls from the kelp is being permanently locked in the sea floor. And there may be some permanent, like thousands of years, sequestration benefit from the detritus. It is not all of the kelp, but it might be like 4% of the biomass over time. And we're working on with 27, or no, not 27, I think 25 farms across the world, including a 300-year-old farm in China, that is actually taking core samples and understanding how much of the carbon from kelp is being sequestered. But I think to focus more on what we know about kelp and that it is incredibly good for the environment as a substitute for anything else that could be there, and some of the locally mitigating effects, or as Sean will talk about on Montauk seaweed, a nitrogen outflow in areas where you wouldn't want to eat the kelp afterward, but in parts of the Long Island Sound that are particularly problematic, or New York, you know, having kelp there to actually remove some of the nitrogen from the water and then use it in farming, that's not a carbon sequestration benefit, but there could be a huge nitrogen outflow benefit, which is really exciting. So I think just focusing on the exciting parts and how many amazing things it can do, including like being put into plastic and replacing plastic, is really where we should be focusing our effort as a scientific community on seaweed.
Oh, so speaking of plastic, the next thing I wanted to talk about, all of you guys, to talk about before we get to questions is markets. Where are we right now with markets, and where are we going? Because it's a really exciting space if R&D is your thing. So, and I know Bree has plenty to say about this. I don't know if Scott and Aaron would want to jump in and then let Bree kind of clean up our conversation, so to speak.
All right, so well, I'll just close out that one thought, maybe connect the two between the carbon sequestration story and markets, and then Bree is going to know much more than I as far as like what the kelp market is and the capacity is for the kelp marketplace. I think all of just the general discussion that we're having about carbon sequestration in our food systems and our production models is very positive. There's a tendency for large established entities to commandeer some of those equations, and carbon markets is a good example of that. I think that's why it's getting so much notoriety in standardized media, is that there's a big opportunity and people are being sold that farmers are now creating a new crop with carbon sequestration marketplaces. I think we just look at it as a general idea that the net neutrality, the net positive element of any production model is a positive thing. If we're not extracting something that's a non-regenerative resources to grow something else, it's a very positive step. As Bria and Scott had mentioned, there's a lot of elements in mussel production and oyster production and all shellfish production and then kelp that it is a net positive approach. And returning to those practices of understanding these natural systems and us being part of that. E.O. Wilson's book on Half Earth is an example of that, of, we need to preserve half of the planet to being in nature and natural order. And then our production models have to marry some of those better practices. So carbon sequestration is a natural iteration of that. So there's a lot of buzz, a lot of media, a lot of information about that, but I think that's where the marketplaces put their time and effort. It's a bit like alternative meat production. There's a lot of money behind those things. So that's why you see a lot of those programs. It's not always best for the producers, for the marketplace, but at least we're having these conversations. So that is a marketplace, I think that's burgeoning, that's happening, and it will be sussed out in a different way. Also just one point I think it's interesting on the kelp side of things is that correlation, that crossover. Bree had mentioned the discussion that it is a feed stuff that could go into bovine and for cows, and it reduced methane levels. Sure, I mean, that's a great step. It ultimately, if you're in the terrestrial side, it's not the cow, it's the how. It's our methodology of getting out of the CAFOs, putting these animals on open pasture. And really what it does is it introduces biodiversity into their feedstuff. So very positive thing. Anytime you have biodiversity for our health, for animals' health, for environmental health, it's a very positive thing. Kelp was the what eradicated the potato famine 150 years ago by introducing this into our lands to get rid of a monoculture and actually creating. So there's all of these good examples that we can tap into of where kelp, oyster production, or just really taking from what's the sea, putting it on the land and introducing these biodiversity levels that I think will be sussed out in marketplaces across the space. But I think, Jennifer, your question is more directly to who's buying kelp, for what purpose, how do we do that? And I think Bree's the one to answer that the best. And Scott, unless you have something to join in on that.
Yeah, I'll only add that if as I expect, Sea Green's kelp follows the path that locally grown, locally produced agricultural products and aquaculture products have followed, that the demand will continue to increase, because as consumers continue to become more educated and want to know where their food's grown, how it's grown, who's growing it, that they're going to move more closer to purchasing those products if they're accessible to them. So I think that the details surely Bree has, but I think generally, I think the markets will continue to grow where that is, as and was already mentioned, people eat more seafood today than they did 10 years ago, and that's going to continue to increase as we all try to influence our own lifestyles and our own longevity and health profiles. So I do expect the markets will continue to grow for kelp and sea greens and aquaculture generally.
So I need to circle back for 1 second. I got a question that's more directly related to the carbon sequestration. And so I agree with pretty much everything Bree said about where we are in this concept. There's a lot of interest I find from the venture capital world looking to invest in opportunity in carbon sequestration. And so I do get specific phone calls about what's the criteria, how does it look, where do we stand? And my opinion on it is that it's nascent, that we don't understand the science of it yet, that it's very, very important to me personally that we approach this whole topic in a very measured way, and that we bring together all the parties across, there's not a lot of people, right, working in this space, but if we could come up with a framework that makes sense for everyone that is working in this space, we'd be way ahead of where we are in a lot of other places on this planet as far as this topic goes. And so there's people like Oceans 2050 who are doing this work and research in kind of what do the ecosystems look like under these kelp farms. There are the other folks looking at sinking seaweed, and there's plenty of other people around the planet who have their own ideas, small farmers, medium-sized farmers, new farmers, people who've been farming kelp for a longer time, who believe they have the answer to this. And I am concerned that we're never going to get to a point where there's, I want to say, a uniform approach or an agreed upon methodology upon which to base our assessment on the success of kelp and carbon sequestration. So I just wanted to kind of add that into the conversation. And there are some larger like NGOs like EDF, World Wildlife, who are starting to maybe serve, I want to use the word as honest broker potentially, to bring all of these different methodologies and ideas and different approach to science together. So I'm hoping that the organization of EDF in particular is starting a series of meetings this spring in this topic. And I'm hoping that they will include a larger swath of stakeholders in the discussion. So that's kind of where I am in this conversation. And then about the markets. So I wanted Bree not just to talk about the food space of kelp, and I know we're going to have a discussion later about the space of fertilizer, but also potentially, Bree, about there's this, the pharmaceutical industry and the use that we've seen over many, many years of kelp as fillers and thickeners and other things like that in our, I want to say the consumer system, but also in the plastic space in the fabric space so that people understand that it's not just the food space and the pharmaceutical space that we're looking at. There's a lot of other R&D going on that's really exciting.
Yeah, we keep, we have a few salespeople in there each, in many businesses, salespeople are like, you have the Northeast and you have the South. And we're like, you have food, like you have retail food, you have ingredients, you have, you have food service. And then I'm like, God, we need one for like animal feed. We need one for extracts. We need one for alginates. Like we just have like all we're not doing that, but God, like kelp can go in anything. And it's this kind of like, we talk about seaweed farming. It has been around in Asia for about 400 years, but it wasn't until the 70s or 80s where that industry really started scaling up for global production. And so all that to say, it is brand new, even in Asia, where they've been doing it for 400 years, but this kind of idea of global scale, we are not even at the tip of the iceberg of what we can do with macroalgae. And right now in the Northeast right now, that is sugar kelp and skinny kelp, but the possibilities globally and even in the US are incredible. Like there's so many varieties of macroalgae. There's some with really high levels of polyphenols. You don't want to eat them, but man, you can get polyphenols out of it that can basically sub in for all these chemical compounds, and it's actually just available in the ocean. Alginates, like it's an algae, it comes from kelp, but often that is like alginate alternatives are actually just like chemical compounds because there's never been the raw material to do that. And so there are just so many uses for this. And nutraceuticals, if anyone takes a daily vitamin, look at the back of it, there's seaweed in it. We know that kelp in particular is outstanding for pregnant and nursing women. Look at a prenatal vitamin, there's kelp in it. Where is that coming from? Nobody has any idea. And probably even the people who are making it have no idea where it's coming from. They just get like generic kelp. They don't know where it's grown. They don't know what the heavy metal content is, none of that. So, I mean, I think there's this huge opportunity in the Northeast and Alaska in particular, because the growing conditions are strong. The working waterfront communities continue to be strong. There are places to land it. I don't think we can oversell that. Like you could try to do huge scale aquaculture, kelp aquaculture in Northern California, even if the regulations were great, there's nowhere to land. There's no more working waterfront left. Like we have it here. And we have that infrastructure, and there is a huge opportunity in Alaska and Maine and Massachusetts, regulations aside, to really kind of produce high value, clean product that can be put into amazing uses. So we are looking for corporate partners like the Cargills of the world who are using chemical extracts and actually could find a way to do that in a way that's healthful for the oceans, more health for their consumers by using line-grown kelp. And so food is the tip of the iceberg, but even for food, one thing that I get asked all the time by reporters is this question that I always am just amazed by, because they almost all start with this. It's like, why aren't people eating seaweed? And my point to them is always, it is the fastest growing grocery segment since 1995. And, food segment. So that's like, imagine in the mid 90s being able to say like, oh yeah, you can get sushi takeout at your local grocery store in rural Maine. Like that would have been outrageous. Like you could have gotten it in Boston, New York, LA, but like Maine eating sushi, now you can go up to the middle of nowhere and there's sushi takeout. Seaweed snacks. Anyone that has a kid under the age of 15 or knows a kid under the age of 20 or knows a kid under the age of 20, they're eating seaweed snacks. I have to like limit my kids' ability to eat that, or else they'll eat like 4 containers in a day. The stuff is so good. But what we don't see is innovation beyond the dried sushi, seaweed snack, and bright green seaweed salad market. And so there's so much room for innovation. There should be kelp in Campbell's soups. There should be kelp in Cedar's hummus. There should be kelp in pestos, and you can put it anywhere. And I think we have, let's say 17 aisles in the grocery store. Let's just talk about grocery alone, 17 aisles in the grocery store. Usually in like a Whole Foods, there's about, I think it's 16, it's something crazy, like 16,000 brands represented across Whole Foods nationally. You know, even if 4% of them were putting kelp in their product, even as a hidden thing, Cliff Bar, we need iodine in it, we need potassium in it, we need calcium in it. Kelp does all that. You don't even have to taste it. 1% of the product, and you've suddenly had a kelp market far beyond our wildest dreams right now. And so I think that's just, we need to be like thinking about seaweed differently, is like, let's replace some of the extractive, unhealthful things that are in our food with seaweed. Even if we don't taste it, it's there for the nutritive compounds and for the ways to help in climate change, and to add a little bit of umami, because umami, again, in the 90s, no one knew what that was. And now everyone's like, umami, that let's put salt on our chocolate chip cookies. Like, yeah, of course, it makes it better. And like umami makes things better. And so there's this whole entire flavor profile that we can be adding to everything. But beyond food, there's even more opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you, Bree. So it is 10:12 and you guys ask us questions. I see some of them popping up, but I think Doug's going to moderate that a bit, correct?
Yes, I'm happy to. And we can start with one of the first questions that came in from Anne. How can we know that the water that the shellfish and kelp and sea greens that we're growing in isn't contaminated?
Scott, it's
Yeah,
different,
I could take,
by the way. So
yeah, I could take a swing at that. As I mentioned on the sea green side, and as Bree just alluded to, it's difficult unless there's testing that's done at the facility themselves for the quality of the product, the ingredient, whatever that product is. On the shellfish side, however, and the hope is that because there was, at least in Massachusetts, a division of marine fisheries who also regulates shellfish aquaculture, had some influence on the regulation of marine algae culture, is that they are governed by this National Sanitary Shellfish Program that really requires the continuous testing of water quality and classification of growing areas where shellfish are grown. So virtually every town, and I would invite any of you who buy shellfish to ask to see the tag when you buy the shellfish, because every piece of shellfish that is sold has to have a tag on it that goes from the producer, the harvester, whether they're a wild harvest or farm-raised harvest, all the way through to that final consumer. If it's a restaurateur, the restaurateur will have those tags in the back of them. They're required to hold them that'll identify the growing area where that shellfish came from. So there's embedded traceability and all the way back to clean, open water sources, classified growing areas that are typically classified as approved for where the shellfish come from. But again, and I'm sure Bree can add more to this. To my knowledge, there's no specific testing that's been required by law at this point around sea green additives. And that's one of the challenges, as Bree mentioned, when they don't know, even these manufacturing companies that are using a derivative from the sea greens or sea kelp in a manufactured product, where did that come from? Where is it grown? What are the metabolomes? And we really don't know the answers to those questions at this point.
I think this is, I'm going to toss this up to Aaron, and Scott, you said it exactly right, is because Aaron has focused so much of his life on terrestrial agriculture. One thing that I find really interesting when we get these questions from people like, how do we know it's not contaminated? I'm like, have you ever asked where your broccoli's from? What makes you think that your broccoli isn't grown in super leady soil? Like, you know, most people at this conference over the next 2 days are very familiar with problems with terrestrial agriculture, and they're the same in aquaculture. This is why we need to buy from trusted sources. We need to ask about traceability. We need to keep the industry honest. And when we say this is local, this is in the clean, cold waters of Maine, you know, we're not going to say like, don't buy from the places that have like the crazy high heavy metals. But what we're trying to say positively is we have the cleanest water in the country in Maine. This is where we're growing our seaweed. And hopefully that resonates with people and the traceability, but this is true in all of food. And it's just because this is new, people get a little bit scared, but you know, all the food we eat is so much of it is contaminated and there's so little regulation. And I'll just throw it back to Aaron on that because he's studied this forever.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Perception's reality. We're trying to introduce, even, you know, for folks that are probably listening in an organic conference, even breaking the mindset that a soil test is a chemistry test versus a biology test is like worlds of new thought. So understanding their you know, I'll just say that to Bree's point, the opportunity to buy local sea green production oysters is tremendous. We do have the clean cold waters of New England. Often we commoditize many of those goods and they're shipped around the world without that moniker. That is actually one of the best opportunities I think we have in our coastal and marine environments, is to leverage the fact that going forward, it's going to be continue to be a differentiator that we have versus other parts of the world. So New England-based kelp production is going to be the gold standard, purely because of the way that we are treating our ecological systems and the protections that we have on our marine waterways. So yeah, I mean, I think that's just a kind of a general awakening that consumers are having. I think there's been a lot of vested interest in folks not to be concerned with having that cloak over what our food and where it comes from and what those adverse effects, what persistent pesticides, what herbicides are doing, the impact on us, the impact on the planet. So maybe the coattails can be ridden from marine production models, just like we're seeing in terrestrial models. So I think there's Lewis has a hand up here. So.
There is.
We're happy to take questions. Thanks, Lewis.
Lewis, I think you're on mute.
Hello, can
Okay.
you hear me? Good morning. Thank you I came late into the conversation, but I'm very interested in finding sources for recipes for compost. We're gonna be opening social equity indoor cannabis farm in Malden, Massachusetts. And I'm an experienced farmer in Vermont, but I'm new in Massachusetts, so most of my resources are in Vermont, and I'm gonna need to find sources in Massachusetts for all those ingredients for super compost formulas. This is gonna be an indoor farm, so we're gonna need an outdoor place to be able to produce those formulas. So I'm reaching to every one of you to have ideas of places where we can produce it, or a partner that we can find that can produce those formulas for us. But you know, any advice, I will really appreciate it.
Lewis, we have very few, we have very little waste, but when there are crops that we can't take because of quality for food, or when we have scraps that fall on the floor during production, farmers come to pick those up every day. So we have zero waste for compost, or for just generally throwing on their gardens or their farms. We have pig farmers that come pick up. So we're happy to work with people in a more organized way for that, to get people the seaweed that they need. Our harvest season starts at the end of March, which is usually when people get really excited about getting some kelp for gardens. And we take our C grade kelp and open those distribution networks. So you can just write us at info@Atlantic Sea Farms about any of those questions.
Give me the address again.
Info, I'll put it in the chat too, but it's info@Atlantic Sea Farms.
I think, Lewis, to add, just more general information about that. I saw some of the actual sponsors of this event. To give our sponsors a plug here, were Elaine Ingham. I actually started my process, this whole practice, back in 2004 with Elaine, studying her programs, going in her analysis. I think her approach to understanding soil health is fantastic. She uses things like compost teas, where you only need a small amount of extract that you can put into your soils. Another person right here locally in Maine is Will Brinton. He's got World's End Laboratory. And then another sponsor, I think, of this event is Black Earth, which is a Massachusetts-based program, which is they source wonderful compost, highly tested in both the biodiversity and the biological health of their soils. They'll take things like when a carcass of a marine animal comes ashore, they'll actually harvest that, pull it in, and put it into their compost stream. So you get oodles of incredible amounts of biodiversity. So there are resources, and I think just even looking at some of the sponsors of this event, Doug, you can speak to that too, but those are some great resources that I'm familiar with.
Yeah, and we are willing to purchase things with, you know, it would be nice to have scraps, but we do have the budget to be able to purchase kelp or one or any other thing too.
Yeah. Louis, I just shared in the chat, there's a company out in Turner's Falls, I mentioned earlier in the presentation today, Great Falls Aquaculture. They make a great fish hydrolysate product. Their facility. I would encourage you to contact them. I know they're working with different cannabis producers now as well to use that their ingredients as part of the nitrogen source.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Okay.
go ahead.
Oh, you if you would.
I just said there's a question, but I don't know if Joan's still on the call about, oh, there you are. I see you. About an introduction for ocean farming. Are you speaking specifically for seaweed?
Just anything to read to educate myself, just whatever you guys suggest is, you know, the Bible for what you guys started with.
There's a great book called Slime. And I don't remember the author, but it's a really fun read. And it talks about how algae has sort of formed the human eating experience. And it's the only seaweed book that I get excited about. The other book that we kind of think about a lot with how we got to where we are in the fishing communities in Maine and Massachusetts, and why we kind of do this work, is the Lobster Coast. It's not about seaweed, but it's about the opportunities we need to in order to think about our working waterfront systems differently. And that's by Colin Woodard.
I love this. I'm gonna go to Aaron and then Scott for their recommendations.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Aaron.
No, go ahead, please.
I insist.
No, Scott, come on.
Okay. I would as a slave to the academic process when I was coming up through school, there's a Stickney, and let me just get the right title for this book, but it's an introduction to aquaculture, an introductory text, and it goes soup to nuts. It's kind of the standard aquaculture 101 that guides folks through the various production systems, where they're produced, how it's produced, and kind of gives you a good overview and teaches you some of the language that's used in the aquaculture industry generally.
Maybe you find it, Scott, and put it in the chat.
Sure thing.
I mean, I think one of the Bibles, not necessarily about aquaculture, but Paul Greenberg's book, For Fish, which talks about like a lot of the lineage of fisheries, talks about oyster production in New York, what has happened, the benefits of oyster production, what the reefs can create, how this is a capacity for so many of these, you know, the problem solvers that we have by re-engaging with nature and these marine environments is a great book. I'm trying to remember the author. She wrote the book with around oysters in Duxbury. What was the name of the book with Island Creek? She's
Shucked.
Shucked, yeah.
Yeah.
That's always another classic, I think, that people revert to and talk about. So yeah, I mean, there's yeah.
And being a professor, I probably have a list of 20, but when we're not looking at the technical books in our class, I really like a book, The Geography of Oysters. I think is a terrific book to give you a real sense of kind of the how they're so different from where they're each place that they're grown, and kind of the spirit in the oyster growing world. And then also, I don't know what you agree, but I like the book, what is it, by Susan Hatterley or
Yeah.
Satterley. What is it, Chronicles of
It's Seaweed Chronicles. It's a lovely book. I think it's seaweed farming and wild harvest are so different that it felt like a great book to read. Doesn't really inform what we're doing, but my goodness, it is such a cool look into seaweed. So that is another one. You're correct. I like slime better just because it's so crazy to think about how long we've eaten seaweed and algae in general. It just came out, but I think I'm probably like one of 4 people that probably ever bought it, but it is amazing.
Actually, speaking of how long we've been growing seaweed, there's a museum in Scituate called the Irish Mossing Museum.
I did not know that.
So, and it's amazing. I've actually had them come to a workshop and they have a lot to share. And so if people are really interested in New England and the history of seaweed in New England, it's a great source.
One other good book, Louis, I would throw out there as far as you were talking about composting and that capacity. I mean, there's a lot of interesting books now that are coming out of composting, but I think the Bible, the early days to start to toe the waters on the technical side is Teeming with Microbes. That's always like a classic book that introduces, it becomes like the citizen scientist idea. I think it gives you many threads to pull to get into that. And it gives you a chance to understand it. And they introduce this idea of this biodiversity come from sea and land and the correlation. So that will be an interesting read, which is, I guess, what we're all looking for here, right? Engaging literature. Cool.
Looks like, Doug, before we split, it looked like Ann Hurley also had a question about quahogs. There was years ago thriving quahog aquaculture industry in Massachusetts, not to the extent that oysters is today. You can grow them, but they don't grow typically in cages the way you grow oysters in cages. They typically grow on the bottom in substrate. So it takes a pretty unique site to grow quahogs. And there's also this nasty critter out there called a quahog pathogen unknown, QPX, which, as the name implies, nobody's really traced down exactly how to get rid of that parasite that doesn't hurt us, but it can hurt juvenile quahogs in particular. So it's there, and the market isn't as strong for quahogs farm raised as it has been for oysters, although it is coming up. The market is improving, so possible, but not to the extent that oysters are grown in Massachusetts.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. We are coming up on about the time where we need to end it. And I echo the comments in the chat. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much for kicking that off. And for the folks who were enraptured as I was, there's going to be this afternoon 2 more events that have to do with this thread of regenerative aquaculture. And then coming throughout the year, we'll have some hopefully in-person events in the spring and potentially next fall, where we get to maybe even see some of the gear that is being used in these cropping systems.
Awesome. Can I do a plug for my friend Sean Barrett for his Sea to Soil conversation? Is totally worth a hit. He's doing some really cool things and just an awesome and engaging person.
Yes, and that one is, if I'm not mistaken, making sure, yeah, it's coming up. That's at the 2 p.m. session this afternoon.
Put the link so it make it easy on everyone in the chat.
Yeah, that will be, it's in the program book. The best place to go is into the program book, and I'll drop a link in a little bit.
Great.
Wow.
Great, and then the talk at actually 4 is by the folks at UNH who have this multiplex system where they grow mussels, seaweed, and steelhead trout.
Mm.
It's a pretty cool thing they're doing.
Exactly. Yeah, so a lot to wrap our head around and a lot of inspiration coming up. So before we wrap up, I want to draw your attention to the link we're going to drop down here below in the chat. Is an evaluation We will appreciate you to take this evaluation for after every session and help us make our programs better. As well, we encourage you to visit our vendor marketplace. And there are some generous discount codes available and information at this link below here for our vendor marketplace. And then our auction is live still up until Sunday evening. We have, again, some very interesting things to bid on, oysters, as well as a course with Elaine Ingham for her soil science course. So though any of those things sound interesting to you, keep an eye on that auction, and it closes on Sunday at 6. As well, if you are an organic land care professional, this fulfills 1.5 continuing education credits for you. And then we are running, as we mentioned, several other conference sessions today and tomorrow. Our keynote speaker is Precious Fury, so tune in at 11 for that. And then we just want to make sure that you have the program book. So if there are any questions about where to find different information, you want to go back to that program book. You'll have links to all the sessions as well as contact information for the presenters. So it's a great resource for you to hold on to. That's it for me. Thank you again, everyone. I'll keep this room open just for another second. If you're copying links in the chat, I'll keep it open for a couple more minutes for you.
Doug, Jennifer, thanks for organizing this. Appreciate it.
Oh, grateful you guys came and participated, and very grateful you answered my call.
Thank you all. Thanks to the attendees. Appreciate your attention.
Thank you, everyone. Great questions. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks for you. Stay warm today, everyone.
I just made a fire. I'm fine. I just sent Aaron a picture. I made a fire while I was on mute for a second. I don't think I could have sat here for one more minute without it.
Thank you, everyone.